All right, guys. Okay, so for those of you on Twitch, my name's Rob Ferguson. I'm one of the TAs in this class, and I'm going to be presenting today on the subject of Texas and how Texas ends up joining the Union. Just quick announcement, there will not be a class on Friday. Okay? So no class on Friday. Exams are in the process of marking. We should have them back sometime early next week. And anticipating questions related to the exam and this lecture, or the next exam and this lecture. If for whatever reason there's an exam question that comes out of this lecture, just put my name in there rather than Dr. Nelson's for where there might be some disagreement with Harry Watson. Just anticipating that question. All right? The Slido number is 448246. And, okay. I'm just going to leave that up there for a second longer. For those of you who, I'm assuming most of you folks know this, but if you don't, Texas used to be part of Mexico. And before it was part of Mexico, it was a part of the Spanish Empire. Right? We've talked a little bit about the Spanish Empire in this class, but the Spanish Empire continues to exist in the New World, right into the 20th century. But in the 19th century, one of its most prosperous colonies was what they call New Spain. And New Spain was throughout Mexico and Central America and part of South America, but its most profitable area was in what we would call today Mexico. Spain begins to lose its grip on Mexico, on the colonies during the Napoleonic Wars. We've talked again a lot about the Napoleonic Wars in this class. The Napoleonic Wars were very expensive for Spain. So expensive that they were worried about, going bankrupt. Not being able to service the interest on the debt that they'd managed to accrue. So what they do is they decide that they're going to squeeze their colonies even tighter for revenue. Okay? From the Spanish perspective, from Madrid, why else do they have colonies unless they can squeeze them for revenue in times of crisis? So that's what they begin to do. And one of the things that they do is they look at, here I'm going to just jump into the PowerPoint here for those of you who can see it. Right, of course. All right, and slideshow, right? One of the things that they decide to do is they decide to go after the church's assets in the colony. And when I say the church, I mean, anyway, that's the outline. Don't worry about it. You're going to get the outline a few more times, so don't worry about it. This is just a map of New Spain. They go after the Catholic Church in Mexico. The Catholic Church has, as you guys may or may not know, has often accrued a bunch of wealth throughout history. And it's often been a tempting target to take that wealth for governments that are desperate for money. And in 1804, the Spanish government is desperate for money. So what they do is they decide to basically take all of the wealth that the Catholic Church owns in New Spain. They'd done this before in Spain itself, and it had been relatively successful. So they're going to just repeat that play in the colony. The problem is that in New Spain, the Catholic Church is pretty much the bank for all of the landowners. All of the smaller landowners, I should say, in Mexico, not the bigger ones. They have access to different credit. But for the small and middle-sized landowners, there's not really a bank that they can turn to in New Spain, other than the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church becomes the lender for basically the entire colony. The way that these loans worked, and it's just briefly important to know how they worked, is they weren't typical mortgages. They were more like a home equity line of credit. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of those before. But the idea is that for a 5% interest fee, they would give you you'd borrow money to buy the land, right? And for 5% interest, as long as you paid service that 5% interest rate every year, the loan was open. You were in good standing with the Catholic Church. So what that meant is that nobody was really inspired to pay back principal, right? In a typical mortgage, you pay back principal and interest, right? But on these loans, you were just paying the interest. And so what that meant is that the loans were carried over for generations. People just paid the 5% every year, and that was cool. But now, all that land is being expropriated by the Spanish government. And rather than just taking over being the lender, what the Spanish government decides to do is they say, no, we're taking all this land. And you can have that land back, Mr. Small or medium-sized landowner, as long as you pay back all the principal that you originally owed on that loan. And you have 12 to 18 months to do it. The reason most people weren't paying back principal, they didn't have the principal. So they ended up losing a lot of this land. And what this does is it creates a middle class that's now been deprived of all of their property. And this severs the relationship between the middle classes and the Spanish crown. Then, of course, what the Spanish crown does in order to make up the money from all this land is they start selling it to rich, connected people, either with the colonial administration or with people back on the Spanish peninsula. Right? People who don't need credit from the church, people who have either their own money or have access to different forms of credit, often from the crown. So this severs that relationship. The Mexican War of Independence doesn't happen right away. It happens, basically there's more instability in Spain. The Napoleonic Wars are going on, right? More instability. The monarchy is overthrown, the monarchy comes back in. And what ends up happening is that eventually there's a series of revolts that start in 1810 that last until 1821. And by the end of this period, Mexico is independent. They've won their independence from Spain. Initially, they put a government in that's a monarchy. They call it the Mexican Empire, the first Mexican Empire. There will be a second. The first Mexican Empire. But that government itself is overthrown in 1823. And they put a new government in place that's based on federal republican principles. Basically, they're taking the idea from the U.S. Constitution and they're applying it in Mexico, where you have a central government with a Congress and an executive, and you have different state governments as well. And there are elections to those bodies. Okay, and that's the Constitution of 1824. Throughout the process, throughout the end of the Mexican War of Independence and the start of the independence period, Mexico is, and first Spain, but then Mexico, is trying to figure out what to do with this northern territory that they have, which now today we call Texas. Part of it's Texas. There's not a lot of not a lot of agriculture going on up there, not a lot of mining. It's not really all that economically productive. But what it is it's a highway that the Comanche Empire is using to raid northern Mexican farmers. Okay? The Comanche Empire, I have a map of this, if you could see it, but if you're in the room, you can't see the map. Basically, it runs from what would now be kind of southern Kansas to central Texas. Okay? And the northern part of the Mexican heartland is frequently being raided by Comanche warriors. And the Mexican government is tired of this. And so what they decide to do is they decide to attract settlers from the southern United States to settle on this land, to farm this land. Maybe they'll make it productive, but most importantly, they'll serve as a buffer between the Comanche and the existing agricultural complex in Mexico. They invite a guy named Moses Austin, he dies before he ends up making it there. Turns into a guy as his son takes over, Stephen Austin. If that name Austin sounds familiar, it's because it is today, the capital of Texas today is called Austin because of this. What they do, this settlement, is something called the impresario system. The impresario system is the Mexican government deeds somebody a huge amount of land, like thousands of acres, okay? In return, they have to convert to the Catholic faith, they have to commit to assimilating, like learning Spanish, that kind of thing, accepting Mexican law, and taking up arms for the government if they're ever invaded. Those are sort of the terms. And they get land essentially for free if they do this. The impresarios then subdivide their land, right? You know, subdividing land, right? If you've got like a section of land today, which is a mile by a mile, and maybe you want to turn it into 4 quarter sections and then sell those quarter sections off to various farmers. That's called subdividing land, right? So what they do is they take these massive land grants, subdivide them, and sell them in the United States for about 5 cents an acre. Really cheap to people in the southern United States who want to move to Texas, which is now part of Mexico. Okay? There's a lot of people in the southern United States who are really eager to leave the southern United States. A lot of them have gotten into serious trouble in the Panic of 1819. They're escaping debts, right? They've got sheriffs knocking on their doors in Missouri or like in Kentucky or Tennessee saying, hey, pay up. And they're leaving in the middle of the night and they're going to Texas, where American authorities can't touch them. Okay? So this is that first major American wave of immigration into Texas. And pretty much immediately there's tensions with the Mexican authorities and the Spanish-speaking population. The impresarios were told that, like, okay, all of our settlers are going to have to learn Spanish, are going to have to convert to the Catholic faith, but they maybe didn't tell the people who bought the land from them about that part. These land sales are very shady. Okay, very, very shady. And in fact, as I'll come to in a second, I actually think that one of the reasons for the Texas Revolution is the people who are, a lot of the political leadership is afraid of being caught in this fraud in these land sales. Many of these settlers are, of course, coming from the southern United States, many of whom are enslavers. These are not the big slave owners, right? These are not people with massive plantations. These are typically small and middling size enslavers. So people who may have between 5 and 1 in like 40 people that they hold in bondage. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. I mean, if you're going to move to Texas and you're going to move all of these people that you hold in bondage with you, it's going to be really hard to move hundreds. So it's really only going to be possible if you have a couple of dozen, right? Just from a strictly logistical perspective. The other thing is that the American settlers, and again, this is where a map would be handy, don't settle in the area that the Mexicans hoped they would. They don't settle as a buffer between the Comanches and the northern Mexican farmers. The Americans arrive in Mexico, take one look at the Comanche Empire and go, nope, and they go settle by the coast. And they all hug the coast, which is the more productive cotton growing land anyway. So what ended up happening is that the Mexican government was hoping to bring in settlers that could make land that was currently not that productive for them productive, but most importantly be a buffer between them and the raiding that was occurring from the Comanches. But instead what they've got is people who won't learn the language, won't really adopt a Catholicism beyond doing it nominally, are enslavers, and are hugging the coast. And these people are not loyal to the Mexican government. There is a lot of argument, disagreement over the cause of the Texas Revolution. This is the revolution where Texas becomes independent. You've probably heard of the Alamo, right? The Battle of the Alamo is one of the battles that's a part of the Texas Revolution, of the War of the Texas Revolution against Mexico. I mentioned earlier that I think one of the issues was fraud, that people were trying to escape potentially the consequences of the fraud they've committed. Until I did the research for this lecture, I was pretty much certain it was just slavery, that the people in Texas did not want the Mexican government to emancipate their slaves. Because what happens is that in 1829, the Mexican government issues an Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? And in 1835, the Texans revolt. Obviously, there's a bit of a time gap there. It's usually attributed to the fact that there is that basically at first nobody bothers to try to enforce it. And it isn't really until 34 and 35 that the Mexican government actually tries to enforce this. The problem that I've seen in the literature, just in doing the research for this lecture, is that a lot of the people who subscribe to that idea are really just inevitably going back to Santa Anna's propaganda. And Santa Anna is a military, or is what's called in Mexico a caudillo. He's a strong man. Out of the area, out of the region of Veracruz, which again, if I had a map of Mexico that you guys could look at, it would be very helpful.
It doesn't look.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It doesn't look great, but
yeah. So the Veracruz area is kind of down, well, here-ish. Okay. Now I don't know what I've done. It's okay. Pardon me? Somebody has a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the empresario system, the U.S. ever sell the land to other settlers? Oh, that's great. You've got an actual map.
I did. Not anymore. Now everything's gone. Uh-oh. Yeah, so the empresarios were
give me a sec. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Are there any other questions?
Here we go.
Oh, perfect. Here we go.
Sorry, let me just restart.
Oh, it's going.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot of disagreement over what the cause of the Texas Revolution in 1835 is, and I by no means am enough of an expert on this period to be able to tell you one way or the other. I don't know. A lot of historians who were eager to, it often depends on your ideological persuasion, I guess, is the answer. Santa Anna, a name I mentioned just before we had that issue there, he was a strong man from Veracruz, and Santa Anna is a defining Mexican political figure of this period. He's president, I think, 7 times, And he launches revolutions against his own government while he is president. Like, this guy is constantly launching rebellions. So he launches a rebellion, and he's the guy that leads a rebellion in 24 that leads to the liberal government being put in place in 24. He launches another revolution in 28, another one in 29, another one in 32, and then he's a part of one in 34. Okay? And then when he wins the presidency, what he does is he says, okay, I'm president now, you're going to do all the work, and I'm going to go to my hacienda in Veracruz. And that's pretty much what happens for like 30 years in Mexico. It's a very unstable period. Governments are coming and going all the time. And sometimes it's Santa Anna's fault, and sometimes it isn't Santa Anna's fault. The fact is, it's just a very, this isn't a Mexican history class, and frankly, a lot of the Mexican history in this period is very confusing. But all you have to know is that it's very unstable. There's a government that's in place between 29 and 32 in Mexico that they call the radical government. This is the government that emancipates the slaves. Okay? It's an anti-clerical government. It's attacking the church. It attacks the big landowners. It's very much it's radical in the sense that it is very much in favor of individual rights, wants to emancipate the slaves, and doesn't like the church. And also is afraid of the army. So they're also taking away money from the army all the time. Attacking the church in Mexico, attacking the big landowners, and attacking the army is a recipe to get yourself in trouble. And this government gets itself in trouble. Santa Anna's president overseeing this government, but then he switches sides. And he associates with the church, the big landowners, and they overthrow this radical government in Mexico in early 1835. And what they do is, you remember I was talking about that liberal constitution in 1824, right? That was based on the American Constitution. They get rid of that. They say, nuh-uh, we're not going to have state governments anymore. We're not going to have trial by jury. And basically all of the power is going to be centralized out of Mexico City. This is sort of, and this is where it gets confusing, in the Texas historiography, like the triumphalist Texas, like, remember the Alamo, we're freedom lovers, liberty lovers. This is the story that they tell, is that this dictatorship takes power in Mexico City and they're fighting against this dictatorship. Santa Anna suggests that part of this dictatorship was designed to actually emancipate the slaves. And they felt they could only do so partly through a dictatorship. That seems like he's apologizing for it to some degree. Especially because a lot of this literature comes after Santa Anna's already lost in Texas, so he's sort of trying to justify himself. So the best that I can say is that slavery had something to do with it, anger at the new Constitution had something to do with it, and trying to escape fraud probably had something to do with it. I don't know exactly, take your pick how much of which you want, you want to, what you want. There's huge history wars about this in Texas right now. Anyway, Santa Anna himself actually leads the army into Texas to try to quell this rebellion. This is where the Alamo happens. If I got the picture, yeah. For those of you who've ever been to San Antonio, the Alamo is right downtown. And it's wild because, you go to a tourist site and you sort of expect that it's going to be off the main road a little bbit. Like there's going to be an entrance, you're going to have to go walk up a path or something. But no, it's like retail frontage, the Alamo. There's there's a bank on one side and a hotel on the other, and it's just right downtown. This is not a picture of the Alamo. This is taken from the Alamo. And right across the street is Tomb Raider 3D, the ride, and that's where Santa Anna's forces would have been actually deployed. Anyway, I don't think Tomb Raider 3D was there then, but anyway. What happens at the Alamo is that Santa Anna leads this large Mexican force into Texas. Some Texas forces get trapped in the Alamo at Old Mission, and they're surrounded, and they're basically all killed. However, in the process of being killed, the only people who escape is one woman and an enslaved person named Joe, who's the one who actually tells the story of the Alamo later on. But anyway, in the process of being slaughtered, they managed to inflict enough damage on Santa Anna's forces that when Santa Anna's forces rushes to meet the main Texas forces outside of Houston at a place called San Jacinto, they're destroyed, essentially. And then Texas is able to declare its independence. Okay? Again, Tomb Raider 3D probably was not there. Actually, it's not going to be there much longer. They're putting in a visitor center there, and I think that's unfortunate. But anyway. So now the question is, all right, Texas becomes independent in like 1836. And that's not supposed to read 36 to 36. It's supposed to read 35 to 36. What's going to happen now? Well, the people who run the Texas government, the new Texas Authority, and the people who are in Texas, the white settlers in Texas, desperately want to become American. They want to be annexed by the United States. The problem is, the United States isn't really sure it wants to do that, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Mexico has not really acknowledged their independence and has said that they would go to war against the United States if they tried to annex Texas. The other problem is that, as we'll see, the North is afraid, or there's a fear that annexing Texas will disrupt the second party system. So we're going to get to that in a second. But I want to talk about those who were really attracted to annex Texas into the United States. Southern landowners in the United States, and Southerners generally, who desperately wanted to bring Texas into the Union. And it's worth talking about why that is. In some ways, well, remember how I said that Texas land was selling for 5 cents an acre? Right? Like, that sounds cheap today, and it was cheap back then. Okay? Land was really cheap in the South. But the land that was worth the most was basically land that had had a house put on it, a fence put up, but hadn't yet really been used to grow cotton. And the reason is that cotton is a really hard crop on the soil. Okay? And these planters in the South are really are largely only growing cotton, and they're growing as much of it as they possibly can, and this devastates the soil really quickly. Providence Canyon in South Georgia, this is created by erosion that was basically caused by cotton production, by too much cotton production. Now, it's very pretty, but it kind of is ruined as agricultural land. So what that means is, like, after you grow cotton for a certain amount of seasons, there's diminishing returns, right? Every season there's diminishing returns. So the most productive, or the best land, is the virgin land. In the outline here, I have them referred to as labor ward locusts. So what happens is you get these small and medium-sized landowners, right? And their land isn't worth anything. The only asset that they have that's worth anything are the people they've enslaved. Okay, this is where all their wealth is tied up. And again, the reason is because the land isn't worth anything after it's, or it's worth something. But you aren't expecting to make much of a capital gain on your land. The land is just used to grow cotton, to produce cotton, which you're using your enslaved labor for. So anyway, the richest people, the wealthiest people in the South, although they tend to own a lot of land too, that's incidental to their wealth. Their wealth comes from the amount of enslaved people that they own. So most again, small and medium-sized planters, people who might own a few enslaved people, maybe up to 20, maybe even a little more than 20. What they basically do is they buy really cheap land. They grow a lot of cotton on it for a couple of decades, and then they move west again, right? This is like, imagine locusts moving across the South. This is why Texas becomes really attractive. Because they're like, oh my God, another place, another territory of land that we can destroy to grow our crop, right? And this scares Northerners, who are worried that as the Southerners keep moving west in the South and destroying all this prime agricultural land, eventually they're going to reach the ocean before the Northerners do, and then they're going to turn north and start destroying even more land, right? Anyway, I mentioned that the Texas annexation was going to throw a wrench into the second party system. Dr. Nelson has mentioned a few times that the second party system, the Whigs and the Democrats, that forms around Jackson, and then the second bank of the United States, kind of has this rule. We aren't going to talk about slavery. And the reason they're not going to talk about slavery or make slavery a political issue is because both sides are terrified that slavery will become the dominant issue and that there will be a hard line drawn between North and South, and that will lead to civil war. Martin Van Buren, one of the architects of the second party system and one of the founders of the Democratic Party, writes a famous letter to Thomas Ritchie, who was a Virginia landowner, and he says that we need to create something where those in the South have political ties to those in the North. And we're going to have to split, we're going to need parties, but we need to have parties where there's people in the North and the South who associate with each other against another group of people who are also North and South. Because they're terrified of one party being from the North and one party being from the South. Okay? So Texas stays independent for a decade because the people who have a stake in the second party system are afraid to annex Texas because they know that it will blow the second party system up. What word do I want? Up. And that's because of slavery in Texas. There would be no doubt that if Texas was to join the Union, it would be joining as a slave state. Those in the North are already upset by the amount of power that slave states have in Congress and in the Electoral College. The 3/5 compromise, which you've seen in this, which we've talked about in this class, right? Because of the 3/5 compromise, basically, Southern states have more power in Congress and therefore in the Electoral College than they would otherwise. In the Senate, the idea is we're going to have 50%, this is all coming out of the Missouri Compromise, we're going to have 50% free and 50% slave states. Texas is going to just, annexation is going to throw a wrench into that. The reason it happens anyway is that there's a guy who's president in John Tyler who doesn't really have a stake in the second party system. John Tyler's the vice president in he's elected vice president in 1840 under the Whig William Henry Harrison. Tyler's on the Whig ticket, but he's not really a Whig. Whatever the Whigs are, and they're kind of really hard, they're kind of a little bit hard to figure out. He's definitely really not one of them. What he is a disaffected Democrat who hated Jackson, and the Whigs opportunistically said, well, you're popular in the South, why don't we make you our VP, and that way we'll win the election. Which they do, and they weren't planning on William Henry Harrison dying in 40 days after being inaugurated, but that's what he does. And Tyler becomes president. And he doesn't have any support Eventually it becomes clear he has no support among the Whigs because he disagrees with them on pretty much everything. And the Democrats don't like him, so he has no real support among the Democrats. So the only political coalition that he puts together is like the island of misfit toys. Okay? These are people who follow John Calhoun, South Carolina, and a few others. Basically, it's people who don't really have this stake in the two-party system, are kind of on their own little islands. And coming up to the election of 1844, Tyler starts making noises about annexing Texas. Actually submits a treaty to the Senate. He knows it's going to get refused, which it does, to do it. The reason Tyler does it is because this is all political to Tyler. Tyler wants to be president again in 1844. He wants to win that election. But he knows he's not going to win the Whig nomination, and he knows he's not going to win the Democratic nomination. He takes a look around and says, okay, the most likely Democratic nominee is going to be Martin Van Buren. He's a Northerner, and he basically helped design the second party system. So he's definitely not going to want to annex Texas. And eventually Martin Van Buren writes a letter saying, I am not interested in annexing Texas. The Whig Party is most likely going to nominate Henry Clay, the other architect, in many ways, one of the other major architects of the second party system. And although he's a slave owner from Kentucky, he also is not going to want to annex Texas, and he himself writes a letter saying, I'm not going to annex Texas. So Tyler thinks, and this is not a terrible strategy if your only goal is to be elected in 1844, from his perspective, is annexing Texas is going to be really popular in the South. It's going to be really unpopular in the North. But if I run a campaign where I say that we're going to annex Texas, I'll win a Southern block of votes, and Van Buren and Clay can split the North, and I'll be president again. That's his tactical thinking, okay? What he doesn't count on is Van Buren doesn't win the Democratic nomination in 44. A guy named James Polk does. The reason for that is Van Buren's popular in the Democratic Party, but he's not that popular. Jackson, Watson goes through it a little bit in the book. Van Buren and Jackson fall out, and Jackson, although he's no longer president, is still the most popular guy in the Democratic Party. He sits at the Hermitage outside of Nashville, and people go there to get his endorsement. It's a little bit like Trump sitting at Mar-a-Lago, waiting for potential Republican congressional candidates to go get his stamp of approval. People are basically doing that with Jackson. They're traveling to Nashville saying, hey, will you endorse me? Yes. Okay, if I get Jackson's endorsement, I know I'm going to win. And Jackson basically rigs, he's had a falling out with Van Buren and basically rigs the election, the convention against Van Buren. And his new political apprentice, a guy named James Polk, wins. And Polk says he'll annex Texas. So this throws Tyler's plans into the trash heap. And Polk wins a very tightly fought election against Henry Clay, and the reason he wins is because of the 3/5 compromise. Because again, the South gets a little more power in the Electoral College than they would have had otherwise, and pretty much wins because of the 3/5 compromise. Anyway, and so the United States decides that they're going to annex Texas. He has to deal with Oregon first. He goes and deals with Oregon first. Around this time, the British are also sniffing around Texas. The British are saying, hey, the franchise has been wildly extended in Britain by this point. And a lot of people, and slavery, slavery's been abolished was abolished in the British Empire in 1837. And so the British government, is looking for sources of cotton that may not necessarily be entirely produced by slave labor like in the South. And so they look at Texas and say, you guys produce a lot of cotton. If you guys free your slaves, we'll dump a ton of investment money into Texas. And we'll even acknowledge your independence. You don't even have to be part of the British Empire. The Texans can't wait to advertise this in Washington, right? And so Southern slaveholders don't want free Texas because that's a place for enslaved people to escape to. And it's also, they just would think it's abolitionist fear-mongering on their, rabble-rousing on their border. Polk initially offers to buy Texas. Again, there's a lot of disagreement over whether or not he was serious about that. Oh, this is Polk. Polk, actually, pictures of Polk, I find Polk maybe the most terrifying looking president. Like if you see pictures of him. This is not a terrifying picture of him, that's why I put him up, because I don't have nightmares tonight or cause any nightmares. He's a very intense looking man. This is a little softer, so we're gonna put that one up. But anyway, Polk initially thinks about maybe he could buy Texas, and there's disagreements over where the border is. The Mexicans say the border is the river and oasis, which is, it would give you about half of Texas today, if that was the border. So I've got a map. No, it's not a good map of it. The Texans and the Americans say it's the Rio Grande, which is the border today, which kind of doubles the size of what Texas was. There's a disagreement over that. Polk offers $25 million to the Mexican government. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, especially when you think, oh, the Louisiana purchase in 1803 was $15 million. So it's like, well, with inflation, that should have been taken care of, but there's not really any inflation in this period. Globally, this is actually a bit of a deflationary period. So it's actually not a wildly unfair offer. Or it's not an offer, I should say, it's an unfair offer, but it's not the sort of offer that was intended to be insulting. It's an offer that makes it clear that maybe Polk would have been okay buying it. But he also has some troops on the border, actually a lot of troops on the border. And what happens in Mexico City is that there's another revolution. And the government before the revolution was actually really considering Polk's offer, but this government is then overthrown by a group of military officers and nationalists, and the military officers and nationalists are like, absolutely not, we're going to go to war with America, we'll go to Washington, we're going to invade Washington, D.C. if we have to. Santa Anna says, I'm going to fly the Mexican flag from the U.S. Capitol. Leads to the war. In 1846, there's some skirmishing on the Rio Grande. This turns into the broader war. The Americans win the war. The major reason I think that they do is because their artilleries, they've really learned how to use artillery well. And part of this is because you've got this group of the Junior Officer Corps comes from West Point. Their engineering training is pretty good. And they've learned how to really utilize artillery well with infantry and cavalry tactics. They at least better than the Mexican army does. And there's, the military campaigns you can look up on your own if you're interested. But what ends up happening is that the Americans end up actually capturing Mexico City and forcing a treaty on the Mexican government, which is called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and gives the Americans California, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Texas, parts of New Mexico, and I think that's it. Later on, they will buy, the American government will buy Arizona and another part of Texas. That's called the Gadsden Purchase. And this is the Texas time bomb. This is thrown into the middle of the two-party system, what to do with Texas, and this will frame the entire sectional disagreement that will lead to the Civil War. Okay? Any questions? Last-minute questions? I wasn't really watching the Slido because I forget to do that. Is there anything on the Slido?
Yeah, there was just one other question. It was a follow-up. Who's down there in Northern, who are scared they are going to turn north?
Sorry, who are the okay, so There's farmers in the north, typically grain farmers, and what they're worried about is that these enslavers, because they use up the land and they don't really care about fertilizing the land, that kind of thing, that what's going to happen is that they're basically going to destroy all the good agricultural land. Because of the system that they use, that this slave labor system, which to Northerners by this period is seen as inefficient, it's wasteful and destructive. So that's sort of answer the question. Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody. And again, we're not going to have class. We're not going to have class on Friday, but we will be back on Monday to talk about how the time bomb in Texas leads to conflict and civil war. Thanks.